The Mississippi River in the mid-19th century was a vast and shimmering ribbon of silver that stretched across the heart of the American landscape, its waters moving with a slow and deliberate gravity that seemed to pull the very fabric of time along with it. And on the banks of this great river, the world moved at the pace of a drifting leaf or a rolling fog. The air was often thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine and the heavy sweet aroma of the southern pines that stood like silent guardians along the muddy edges. And as the sun began its long and lazy descent toward the horizon, the sky would transform into a pale canvas of lavender and gold. There was a profound sense of peace in the way the massive steamboats glided across the surface, their great wooden hulls creaking softly as they cut through the gentle ripples, and the rhythmic sound of the splashing paddle wheels was a constant and hypnotic thrum that resonated deep within the chest of anyone standing on the wooden docks. These boats were like floating cities of wood and iron, their chimneys breathing thin plumes of gray smoke that drifted upward to join the clouds, and the sound of the steam escaping the valves was a soft and rhythmic sigh that echoed the breath of the sleeping wilderness. As the twilight deepened into a rich and velvety indigo, the river became a mirror for the emerging stars, and the distant calls of the crickets and the bullfrogs created a natural symphony that rose and fell with the cooling breeze. The pilots in their high glass booths watched the water with a steady and unblinking gaze, noting the subtle shifts in the sandbars and the way the willow branches dipped low into the stream, their hands resting lightly on the spokes of the great steering wheels as they guided their vessels through the winding bends of the delta. Everything about the river was measured and slow, from the way the silt settled on the bottom to the way the moss hung in long gray tresses from the ancient oak trees that lined the levees, and there was no hurry in the current as it journeyed toward the Gulf. The passengers on board the grand steamers would find themselves lulled into a deep state of relaxation by the steady vibration of the engines and the sight of the endless green forests passing by like a slow-moving dream, and the clinking of porcelain in the dining saloon was a distant and comforting sound that signaled the end of another long and tranquil day. Along the banks, the small towns would flicker with the light of oil lamps and hearth fires, looking like small constellations fallen to the earth, and the people living there would watch the passing boats with a sense of quiet wonder and belonging. The river was the artery of the nation, but it was also a place of solitude and reflection, where a person could lose themselves in the vastness of the horizon and the steady flow of the water. And as the night air grew cool and crisp, the mist would begin to rise from the surface in thin white ribbons that danced over the eddies. This fog would wrap itself around the cypress knees and the tangled vines of the riverbanks, creating a world of soft edges and muffled sounds, where every splash of a fish and every hoot of an owl felt like a secret shared between the land and the sky. The weight of the atmosphere was like a warm blanket pressing down on the senses, making the eyes heavy and the mind traveler long after they reached the shore. Her name was Evelyn, and she moved through the grand ballrooms of Natchez with a quiet elegance that seemed to defy the heavy heat of the southern nights. Her gowns were made of the finest silks that whispered against the polished oak floors like the rustle of autumn leaves in a gentle breeze, and she carried herself with a grace that made the flickering candlelight seem to dance just for her. She was a woman of high standing and tragic beauty, whose laughter was often described as the sound of distant silver bells. Yet there was always a soft shadow in her eyes that spoke of a soul searching for something the land could not provide. As she moved through the high society circles of the mid-19th century, she would often find herself drawn to the tall, arched windows of the great plantations, looking out past the manicured gardens and the towering magnolias toward the dark and winding ribbon of the Mississippi River. The river called to her with a low and steady hum that only she seemed to hear, a vibration that resonated with the pearls at her throat and the quiet thoughts in her mind. And she would spend hours watching the way the moonlight turned the muddy water into a shimmering path of liquid mercury. In those moments, the music of the violin and the chatter of the guests would fade into a dull murmur, replaced by the hypnotic sound of the water lapping against the distant shore and the rhythmic pulse of the paddle wheels in the distance. Her beauty was a constant topic of conversation among the elite, but Evelyn felt most herself when the sun began to set and the world turned into a tapestry of long shadows and golden light. For she felt a kinship with the transition of the day into the night. She would sit in her parlor, surrounded by heavy velvet curtains and the scent of dried rose petals, listening to the ticking of a grandfather clock that marked the passage of a time that felt increasingly slow and heavy. Every movement she made was deliberate and calm, from the way she fanned herself with a lace and ivory fan to the way she turned the pages of her leather-bound books, and this stillness was a sanctuary in a world that was constantly changing. The people of the South saw her as a pillar of grace and a vision of refined beauty, but beneath the layers of crinoline and lace, there was a profound stillness that mirrored the deepest parts of the river. She would often walk down to the docks when the evening mist began to rise from the surface of the water, her white dress catching the dim light until she looked like a spirit even before the river claimed her soul. The air at the water's edge was cool and carried the scent of wet stone and wild willow, and she would stand there for a long time, watching the driftwood float silently toward the Gulf of Mexico. There was no hurry in her spirit and no rush in her heart as she observed the slow and eternal cycle of the tides, and the sound of the frogs in the reeds was a lullaby that calmed any lingering restless thoughts. She knew the names of all the great steamboats that passed by her home, the Eclipse and the Natchez and the Robert E. Lee, and she would watch their glowing lanterns fade into the darkness with a sense of quiet longing. Her life was a series of slow and beautiful moments captured in the amber of the era, a time when the world was vast and the river was the only road that truly mattered to the heart. As the seasons changed from the humid heat of summer to the crisp and golden air of autumn, her beauty only seemed to deepen, becoming more ethereal and more connected to the landscape of the Delta. Stone and the Mississippi River looked like a sheet of hammered copper reflecting the dying sun, and it was on this day that Evelyn first laid eyes on Julian, who was a man of the water with skin tanned by the river wind and eyes that held the depth of a midsummer night. He was not a man of her social standing, but a traveler and a dreamer who had worked his way up to the pilot house of a grand steamship. His hands were calloused from the heavy wooden wheel, but his spirit was as light as the foam in the boat's wake. And when they met on the wooden boards of the landing, there was a sudden and profound silence that seemed to wash away the noise of the bustling docks. Their romance was a slow-growing vine that wrapped around the pillars of her heart in secret, for a woman of her rank could never be seen with a man whose only home was a floating deck and whose only fortune was the knowledge of the shifting sandbars and the hidden channels. They met in the quiet hours when the rest of the world was shrouded in the velvet darkness of the delta, finding sanctuary beneath the ancient oaks where the Spanish moss hung like heavy curtains of gray to hide them from the prying eyes of the plantation owners. Julian would speak to her in a low and melodic voice about the distant places the river touched, describing the way the morning mist felt in the high bluffs of the north, and how the stars looked twice as large when viewed from the middle of the wide water, where no land lights could dim their brilliance. His words were like a slow-flowing stream that carried Evelyn away from the rigid expectations of her life, and she found herself falling into a deep and quiet love that was as inevitable as the southward pull of the current. They would sit for hours on the mossy banks with the scent of damp earth and blooming gardenias filling the air, watching the fireflies blink like fallen stars in the tall grass, while the rhythmic chuffing of a distant engine provided a steady heartbeat for their whispered vows. It was a forbidden connection that thrived in the shadows and the stillness, a bond forged in the shared silence of the river night, where the only witness was the moon casting its pale silver glow over the ripples. Julian promised her a life of freedom on the water, where they could drift forever beyond the reach of society's rules.
and Evelyn would close her eyes and imagine herself shed of her heavy silk gowns and the weight of her family's name, becoming as fluid and as free as the Mississippi itself. However, the world of the mid-19th century was not a place for such dreams to flourish easily, and the pressure of her standing began to close in like the rising waters of a spring flood. There were talks of a marriage to a wealthy landowner from a neighboring county, a man who saw her only as a beautiful ornament to grace his halls, and the thought of such a life felt like a slow death to a woman who had tasted the wild and honest air of the river. Julian's visits became more dangerous as the gossip began to swirl like eddies in a storm, yet they could not stay away from the magnetic pull of the landing where the water met the shore. On their final night together, the air was thick and heavy with the scent of rain, and the sky was a deep, bruised purple that signaled an approaching storm, and they stood together on the edge of the levee, feeling the first cold sighs of the wind through the trees. He had to leave with the midnight boat, but he swore he would return to take her away forever. His voice was a steady anchor in the rising gale as he pressed a small silver locket into her hand and told her to watch the horizon for his signal.
Thunder rolled in continuous waves that shook the very foundations of the earth, a deep and guttural resonance that echoed the turmoil in Evelyn's heart as she thought of Julian out on the water in a vessel made of wood and hubris. The Mississippi was no longer a gentle ribbon of commerce, but had transformed into a thrashing leviathan, its waves rising into jagged peaks that crashed against the levees with the force of 1,000 hammers. Massive driftwood logs and entire uprooted trees were tossed about like straw in the white-capped swells, creating a lethal labyrinth for any ship brave or foolish enough to be caught in the channel. The wind screamed through the rigging of the distant boats and tore at the smokestacks, turning the coal smoke into horizontal streaks of soot that vanished into the rain. Lightning flickered incessantly, illuminating the scene in strobe-like flashes of brilliant blue and white, revealing a landscape of total upheaval where the boundary between the water and the sky had been completely erased. Inside the great houses, the lamps flickered and died, leaving the residents in a state of primal fear. But Evelyn remained at her post, her eyes wide and fixed on the spot where she last saw the signal light of the steamboats. The internal storm of her grief and her longing was now perfectly reflected in the external violence of the nature around her, a symbiotic dance of destruction and despair that felt both terrifying and strangely right. The river was reclaiming its power, reminding the world that it could never truly be tamed by steam or steel, and as the muddy waters churned into a frothing death trap, it seemed to be searching for a sacrifice to appease its ancient hunger. The sound of the wind was a chorus of 1,000 wailing voices that drowned out the memory of the ballroom music and the polite whispers of her past life, replacing them with a raw and elemental honesty. Every flash of lightning showed the waves growing higher and the current moving faster, a relentless southward rush that pulled everything into its dark and swirling center. The banks began to crumble under the assault, large chunks of earth falling into the maw of the river with a heavy splash that was lost in the roar of the gale. It was a legendary storm that would be spoken of for generations, a night when the Mississippi showed its true and terrible face to those who had dared to build their lives upon its edge. For Evelyn, the storm was a bridge, a violent passage from the world of stagnant rules into the world of eternal flow, and as she leaned into the wind, she felt the spray of the river on her face like a baptism of salt and silt. The darkness was absolute, except for the electric fire in the clouds, and the roar of the water was a lullaby of chaos that promised an end to the long and weary waiting. She watched as a distant flickering light, perhaps a lantern or a fire on a deck, struggled against the waves before being swallowed by the gloom, and in that moment, her soul seemed to detach from the safety of the shore. The storm raged for hours without mercy, a churning vortex of wind and water that redefined the geography of the delta and left behind a trail of broken timber and shattered dreams. It was the climax of her earthly story, a moment where the physical world and the spiritual world collided in a spectacular display of power, setting the stage for the final tragedy that would bind her to the river forever.
As the night reached its darkest point, the wind began to shift into a low and rhythmic pulse that
Series of creaks and groans that sounded like the river itself was breathing a sigh of relief as it reclaimed its territory. As the water rose to meet the upper decks, the distinction between the land and the river and the sky began to vanish, leaving only a vast and watery grave where the great machines of commerce once ruled. Evelyn stood at the center of this cataclysm with a calm that was more terrifying than the storm, her spirit already beginning to detach from the physical world as she watched the locket Julian had given her slip from her hand and disappear into the churning foam. The collision was the final anchor that bound her to the Mississippi, a physical manifestation of the heartbreak that had been growing in her soul for so long. And as the last of the wooden railings disappeared beneath the surface, the silence returned to the river with a heavy and suffocating finality. The only sound left was the soft lapping of the waves against the driftwood and the distant mournful cry of a bird that seemed to lament the loss of the beautiful woman and the grand ships. The river continued to flow southward, indifferent and powerful, carrying the secrets of the wreck down to the deep places where the light never reaches and where the mud covers everything in a thick and eternal blanket of peace. The water rose with a slow and rhythmic persistence that seemed to follow the very heartbeat of the dying storm. And as the wooden deck of the grand steamer settled deeper into the cold embrace of the Mississippi, Evelyn stood upon the highest point of the listing railing, while the world around her dissolved into a blur of gray mist and churning foam. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and wet cedar and the heavy metallic tang of the river mud. And in that final moment of her earthly existence, she felt a profound and hollow stillness settle over her spirit that was deeper than the depths of the channel below. Her white silk gown was heavy and sodden, clinging to her like a second skin as she looked out across the vast expanse of the turbulent water, searching one last time for the flicker of a lantern or the silhouette of the man she had loved with a forbidden intensity. The thunder continued to growl in the distance, a low and guttural vibration that shook the very atmosphere. But as the first wave of the cold river touched her feet, a sudden and piercing clarity washed over her mind. She realized with a quiet and devastating certainty that Julian would not be coming back through the gates of the storm, and the weight of that realization became a physical force that pushed the breath from her lungs. She filled her chest with the damp, heavy air of the delta, and from the deepest part of her soul, she released a final, soaring scream that was not merely a sound, but a concentrated outpouring of all the grief, the longing, and the grace she had carried through her life. This cry was so sharp and so filled with an elemental power that for one singular, impossible heartbeat, the entire world seemed to fall into a vacuum of absolute silence. The roaring wind ceased its howling, the crashing waves flattened into a sheet of dark glass, and even the heavy rumble of the thunder was choked back into the throat of the sky, as if the nature itself was bowing to the magnitude of her heartbreak. It was a sound that transcended the physical realm, a vibration of pure sorrow that echoed off the limestone bluffs and rippled through the cypress swamps for miles, silencing the crickets and the owls and the very turning of the earth. As the scream faded into a haunting echo that seemed to linger in the mist, human and far more sorrowful. It was a long and tapering wail that would start as a mere whisper among the reeds and grow into a haunting melody of loss that seemed to silence the crickets and make the dogs tuck their tails in fear. The pilots of the passing barges would stand at their wheels with their eyes fixed straight ahead, trying to ignore the way the sound seemed to circle their pilot houses like a physical mist, and they spoke in hushed tones at the trading posts about the lady who refused to leave the water. The sound was always most prominent when the moon was a thin silver sliver in the sky and the humidity was so high that the air felt like liquid silk against the skin, and it carried with it a chilling cold that defied the southern heat. Some said it was the river itself, mourning the beauty it had swallowed, while others whispered that it was Evelyn's spirit calling out for the traveler who had never returned to save her from the rising tide. The sound was so rhythmic that it began to pace the lives of those who lived nearby, acting as a somber clock that marked the transition from the world of the living to the world of dreams. On many nights, a lone fisherman would be rowing back to his cabin only to stop his oars mid-stroke as the wail echoed off the limestone bluffs, feeling a sense of profound and ancient sadness that made the heart grow heavy and the eyes grow weary. There was no anger in the sound, only an infinite and patient longing that seemed to stretch out toward the horizon and pull at the edges of the soul. The riverbanks became a place of pilgrimage for the curious and the grieving who wanted to hear the echo of a love that had been stronger than the storm, and they would sit in the darkness and listen as the water lapped against the shore in a steady and hypnotic cadence. The trees seemed to lean closer to the water, as if they too were listening to the story being told by the ghost of the bell, and the Spanish moss swayed in time with the invisible breathing of the river. Over the years, the sound became a part of the local geography, as much a fixture of the Mississippi as the sandbars and the snags and the constant southward flow. It was a boring and repetitive sound that had a way of lulling the mind into a state of total tranquility, stripping away the worries of the day and replacing them with a deep and heavy sense of the eternal. The story of the wreck was told and retold until the facts became blurred like the edges of the fog, but the sound remained constant and unwavering in its sorrowful beauty. It was the sound of a heart that had found its home in the mud and the mist, a voice that had traded the ballroom for the bayou and the silk for the spray. As the night air grew still and the stars blinked through the canopy of the oaks, the wail would rise one last time before the dawn, a final and lingering note that promised that nothing is ever truly forgotten by the water. The listeners would find their breathing slowing to match the rhythm of the river, their thoughts drifting like leaves on the surface toward a place of absolute and silent rest. The river continued its long walk to the sea, carrying the echoes and the memories and the quiet grief of the lady in the white lace. And in that steady movement, there was a peace that's into the same dark water just to find relief from the sight. Then, as quickly and as quietly as she had appeared, she began to dissolve into the rising steam of the morning mist, her form becoming less distinct until she was nothing more than a pale shimmer in the reeds. The night watchman stayed where he was until the sun broke over the bluffs and the world returned to the colors of brown and green, but he never forgot the rhythmic swaying of her tattered silk or the way her presence had turned the river into a cathedral of quiet sorrow. He told his story at the next port in a low and steady voice, and though some laughed, the older sailors just nodded their heads and puffed on their pipes, knowing that the river has a way of holding on to what it loves and what it has destroyed. This sighting became the foundation of the legend of the Wailing Lady, a figure of high standing now reduced to a guardian of the silt and a permanent resident of the river's deep and quiet places. The image of her tattered silt became a symbol for the passage of time and the fragility of human beauty against the relentless power of the current. And even today, when the moon is right and the fog is thick, the watchmen on the modern tugs look toward the bend and feel the same heavy and peaceful chill. The river remains a place of mystery and rest, where the shadows of the past continue to drift in a slow and eternal circle around the hearts of those who watch the water. As the years drifted by like the slow-moving silt at the bottom of the channel, the legend of the Wailing Lady began to evolve from a mere ghost story into a somber and vital part of the river's natural rhythm, and the sailors who spent their lives navigating the treacherous curves between Memphis and New Orleans started to notice a chilling pattern that linked her spectral presence to the very pulse of the Mississippi itself. It was whispered in the dim light of the engine rooms and shared in the quiet moments between watches that her mournful cries were not just echoes of a lost love, but were in fact a rhythmic and haunting warning that the river was about to reclaim the land. Whenever the spring thaws in the north sent a surge of cold, heavy water rushing down into the delta, and the river began to swell until the brown surface sat level with the tops of the levees, the air would grow unnaturally thick, and a low vibration would start to hum through the wooden hulls of the boats.
This vibration would eventually sharpen into that unmistakable wail, which would rise in volume and intensity as the pressure of the water grew, a sound so piercing and filled with such elemental sorrow that it seemed to vibrate the very iron of the boilers. The veteran captains who had seen 100 floods knew that when the lady's voice reached a certain crystalline pitch, it was time to move the vessels to deeper water and warn the families on the low-lying plantations to prepare for the coming deluge. She became a harbinger of the rising tides, a spectral sentinel whose own tragic drowning had given her a permanent and psychic connection to the weight and the power of the floodwaters. On nights when the sky was a bruised and heavy gray, and the smell of rain was so strong it felt like drinking the air, the wail would roll across the surface of the water in waves of sound that matched the frequency of the churning eddies. It was a boring and repetitive cycle of sound that acted as a dark lullaby for the river valley, a reminder that the Mississippi was a living thing with a memory and a temper that could not be contained by human hands or earthen walls. Sailors began to leave small tokens of respect, like copper coins or dried flowers, near the spots where she
Accompanied her presence a silence so deep that it felt like the world was encased in a thick layer of velvet, where even the rustle of the willow branches was muffled and the croak of the bullfrogs was stilled in a gesture of spectral respect. As she drifted along the shoreline, her tattered lace shroud would catch on the invisible thorns of the night air, billowing out behind her like the wake of a slow-moving steamer, and the scent that followed her was a complex and soothing mixture of cold river water and damp earth, and the ghost of a jasmine blossom that had long since withered. Every movement she made was deliberate and agonizingly slow, a choreography of grief that was both mesmerizing and lulling to any observer who found themselves caught in her quiet orbit. The tears in her eyes reflected the moonlight in a way that made her gaze look like the shimmering surface of a deep pool where the bottom can never be seen, and her expression was one of such infinite patience and quiet longing that it seemed to drain the energy from the air and replace it with a heavy sense of peace. She would bend low over the water's edge, her translucent hair falling like a curtain of dark rain over her shoulders, and she would whisper to the mud in a language that sounded like the bubbling of a spring or the soft sigh of a receding tide. The sight of her, forever searching the silt, was a reminder of the things that the river takes but never truly returns, and the repetitive nature of her quest became a visual lullaby for those who watched her from the safety of the levees. She was a figure of high standing, now reduced to an elemental force of the delta, a beautiful and broken monument to a time of steam and silk that had been swallowed by the relentless march of the water. As the night progressed and the moon moved into its final arc, the lady in the white lace would begin to fade into the general grayness of the pre-dawn fog, her form becoming less distinct until she was just a flicker of light among the reeds, and then nothing at all. But even after she vanished, the heavy atmosphere of her presence remained, a lingering sense of calm and a deep restorative quiet that made the eyes of the watchman heavy with the need for a dreamless sleep. Her search would never end, just as the river would never stop flowing toward the Gulf, and this eternal cycle of loss and memory was the very heartbeat of the Mississippi night. The silt would continue to shift, and the water would continue to rise, but the Wailing Lady would always be there, a translucent guardian of the secrets hidden beneath the mud, moving with a grace that was as old as the earth and as steady as the stars. Every detail of her appearance, from the fraying lace to the weeping eyes, was a thread in the vast tapestry of American folklore, a story that was told not in words, but in the slow and rhythmic pulse of a spectral heart that had found its final resting place in the heart of the river. The observer would feel a sense of total surrender as they watched her, a release of all tension as they realized that in the presence of such timeless sorrow, their own worries were but ripples on the surface of a great and ancient stream. The river continued its work, carrying the image of the lady in its cold and steady embrace, and the night air was a soft blanket that covered the landscape in a peace that was as deep as the channel and as manifestation of the earth's own exhaustion. As the war dragged on through the humid summers and the biting winters of the mid-60s, the legend of the lady became a shared secret among the men of both sides, a common thread of folklore that bound them to the ancient and indifferent power of the Mississippi. She was the guardian of the graveyard, a spectral sentinel who watched over the sunken cannons and the waterlogged uniforms with a patience that was as vast as the delta itself. When the nights were still and the moon was obscured by the low-hanging clouds of a coming storm, her voice would reach a pitch of such pure and hollow sadness that the very current seemed to slow down in respect, allowing the spirits of the newly fallen to find their way into the deep and quiet places of the riverbed. The haunting was a slow and repetitive cycle that mirrored the endless movement of the tides, a boring and steady rhythm of grief that eventually drained the violence from the air and replaced it with a heavy sense of destiny. Even after the smoke of the battles cleared and the ironclads were left to rust in the backwaters, the memory of her presence during those dark years remained etched into the history of the valley, a story of a woman who became the soul of a river that had seen too much death and needed to find a way back to the silence. The silt continued to settle over the bones of the soldiers and the iron of the ships, and the Wailing Lady continued her search, her lace gown now a permanent part of the river's white mist, and her voice a permanent part of the southern night's lonesome song. The weight of the era was immense, but the river was deeper still, and as the century moved forward, the hauntings of the 1860s faded into the soft and hazy memories of the old men who sat on the docks, leaving behind only the steady and rhythmic pulse of the water and the quiet peace of a ghost who would never leave her home. There were many hardened rivermen who had spent their entire lives battling the currents and the snags of the Mississippi, and they prided themselves on their lack of superstition and their reliance on coal and iron and cold, hard facts. And among these men was a captain named Elias, who was known for his skepticism and his loud voice that seemed to drown out the very whispers of the wind. Elias had navigated the river from St. Louis to New Orleans for over 30 years, and he would often sit in the dimly lit saloons on the docks, laughing at the stories of the Wailing Lady, calling her nothing more than the imagination of tired watchmen, or the trick of moonlight hitting a patch of rising river steam. He believed that everything on the water had a logical explanation, from the groan of the shifting sandbars to the mournful sound of the wind through the hollows of the bluffs, and he made it his mission to debunk the myth whenever his steamship passed through the dark and narrow stretches of the delta. On one particularly humid southern night in late July, when the air was so thick it felt like a warm, wet blanket, and the moon was obscured by a heavy layer of amber clouds, Elias was standing alone on the upper deck of his vessel, his arms crossed over his chest as he looked out at the dark and oily surface of the water. The heat was relentless, and the only sound was the steady and rhythmic thrum of the engines, which acted as a hypnotic heartbeat for the touch remains as a reminder that the world is vast and the shadows are deep, and that even the strongest man must eventually yield to the peace of the silence. The water moves on and the stars turn, and the boat continues its steady and hypnotic vibration, carrying the skeptics and the believers alike into the deep and restorative embrace of a dreamless sleep where all stories end in the quiet mud. The legend of the Wailing Lady became a quiet and permanent thread in the fabric of the Mississippi Valley as it was passed down through the generations of families who made their homes in the shaded bayous and the sleepy river towns, stretching from the high bluffs of St. Louis all the way down to the low-lying marshes of New Orleans. And this folklore was not told with grand gestures, but was whispered in the soft light of evening lamps, while the humidity of the southern night pressed against the window screens like a living presence. Grandmother would sit on the creaking wooden porch chairs with a glass of iced tea in her hand, watching the fireflies rise from the tall grass, and she would tell the children about the woman in the white lace, not to frighten them, but to teach them about the rhythmic patience of the river and the way the water remembers every soul it has ever touched. These stories were like the slow-moving current itself, repetitive and steady, and filled with a sense of deep and heavy history that anchored the families to the mud and the silt of their ancestors. In the small fishing villages where the cypress trees dipped their mossy branches into the dark tea-colored water, the parents would tell their sons that if they heard a high and crystalline note cutting through the sound of the crickets, they should lower their voices and bow their heads in respect for the lady who was still searching for her lost love. The folklore became a way of understanding the immense and indifferent power of the American interior, a way of giving a name to the cold drafts that would suddenly sweep through a warm summer house, or the way the river mist would sometimes take the shape of a grieving woman standing on a distant sandbar. From the brick-lined streets of old river ports to the isolated shacks hidden deep within the swamp, the story remained remarkably consistent, a boring and beautiful cycle of loss and memory that mirrored the seasonal rise and fall of the Mississippi. The children grew up with the sound of her wail in their ears until it was no more unusual than the call of a hoot owl or the splash of a leaping gar, and they learned to associate her presence with the turning of the seasons and the coming of the heavy rains. Each generation added its own small detail to the tapestry, perhaps a sighting near a new bridge or a strange occurrence in a modern shipyard, but the core of the legend remained a woman of high standing and tragic beauty whose soul had been traded for the silence of the deep. There was a profound sense of continuity in the way the story moved from lip to ear across the decades, creating a shared heritage of shadow and light that bound the people
to teach them about the rhythmic patience of the river and the way the water remembers every soul it has ever touched. These stories were like the slow-moving current itself, repetitive and steady, and filled with a sense of deep and heavy history that anchored the families to the mud and the silt of their ancestors. In the small fishing villages where the cypress trees dipped their mossy branches into the dark tea-colored water, the parents would tell their sons that if they heard a high and crystalline note cutting through the sound of the crickets, they should lower their voices and bow their heads in respect for the lady who was still searching for her lost love. The folklore became a way of understanding the immense and indifferent power of the American interior, a way of giving a name to the cold drafts that would suddenly sweep through a warm summer house, or the way the river mist would sometimes take the shape of a grieving woman standing on a distant sandbar. From the brick-lined streets of old river ports to the isolated shacks hidden deep within the swamp, the story remained remarkably consistent, a boring and beautiful cycle of loss and memory that mirrored the seasonal rise and fall of the Mississippi. The children grew up with the sound of her wail in their ears until it was no more unusual than the call of a hoot owl or the splash of a leaping gar, and they learned to associate her presence with the turning of the seasons and the coming of the heavy rains. Each generation added its own small detail to the tapestry, perhaps a sighting near a new bridge or a strange occurrence in a modern shipyard, but the core of the legend remained a woman of high standing and tragic beauty whose soul had been traded for the silence of the deep. There was a profound sense of continuity in the way the story moved from lip to ear across the decades, creating a shared heritage of shadow and light that bound the people of the river together in a quiet and contemplative fraternity. The families would gather on the levees during the long, hot nights of August, when the air was stagnant and the water was as smooth as black glass, and they would wait for the first faint echo of her cry to drift up from the delta, feeling a sense of collective peace as the sound confirmed that the world was still turning and the river was still watching. This folklore was a lullaby for the tired and a sanctuary for the restless, a reminder that even in a world of fast machines and changing lights, there were some things that remained ancient and slow and unchanged by the passage of time. The river towns became repositories of these quiet memories, their dusty archives and their front porch conversations filled with the silver-gray mist of the lady's shroud. As the grandchildren became grandparents themselves, they found that the story was the only thing that hadn't faded, a constant and rhythmic pulse that connected them to the land and the water in a way that words could barely describe. The weight of the folklore was like the weight of the water, immense and comforting, and full of a quiet power that led every listener toward a state of total surrender and heavy sleep. The story of Evelyn and the river was the story of the South itself, a place of beautiful tragedies and eternal flows, where the mud covers the past and the water carries the future in a slow and steady embrace. Every
tragedy that once ruled the banks, a boring and steady presence that lulls the weary traveler into a state of quiet reflection. Even in the glow of smartphone screens and the beam of high-powered searchlights, the lady remains elusive yet undeniably there. A flicker in the corner of the eye, or a sudden cold touch on a warm railing that signals the arrival of a spirit that will never find rest on dry land. The lore has adapted to the new century, but the essence of the wail remains the same, a long and mournful sigh for a love that was lost to the storm and a life that was claimed by the deep. The people who maintain the massive levees and the concrete locks often find themselves pausing in their work when the moon is high and the fog is thick, listening for the sound of the lady who warned their grandfathers of the rising tides. She has become a guardian of the modern river as much as she was of the old, a spectral sentinel who watches the tankers and the tugboats with the same tragic beauty that once graced the ballrooms of the South. The weight of her legend is a comfort to those who live along the banks, for it means that the river is not just a body of water, but a vessel of history and soul that continues to flow with a deliberate and beautiful slowness. As the night deepens over the delta and the lights of the bridges flicker like stars, the Wailing Lady continues her eternal walk through the mist, her white lace catching the moonlight in a way that turns the river into a shimmering dream of the 19th century. Every sighting is a thread that connects the present to the past, a slow and repetitive confirmation that some stories never end and some hearts never stop searching the silt for what was lost. The observer finds their eyes growing heavy as they watch the water, the steady movement of the current acting as a hypnotic lullaby that promises a deep and restorative sleep under the watchful eyes of the lady in the white lace. The river continues its long and patient journey toward the sea, carrying the modern world on its back, while the ghost of Evelyn drifts silently beneath the surface, a permanent part of the silence and a permanent part of the peace. The final mystery of the Wailing Lady lies not in the tragedy of her passing, but in the quiet and eternal persistence of her presence, which has become a symbol of the Mississippi River's untamable power and the enduring nature of a broken heart that refuses to be washed away by the relentless passage of time. And as we look out over the dark and shimmering expanse of the water, we realize that she remains because the river itself requires a soul to give voice to its deep and heavy silences. The Mississippi is a force of nature that cannot be contained by levees or locks or human will, and it moves with a gravitational certainty that mirrors the weight of a long-held grief, a slow and rhythmic journey toward the sea that carries with it all the secrets of the mud and the silt and the ancient stones. Evelyn, in her tattered white lace and her weeping grace, has become the human face of this elemental energy, a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the water, where the only law is the steady and patient flow of the current. She remains a permanent fixture of the American landscape because her story is the story of every heart that has ever loved